Episode number 5 of Weekend Extra Edition. Welcome to it. If you've followed the story so far and you've liked it and you haven't subscribed, right in the corner, good way to fix that. If you're just getting into this, just jumping in, this is where I talk about my experience living in an off-the-grid religious cult for a little over 2 decades. I've talked a lot about lifestyle and the physical labor and resources and so on the past 4 weeks actually. And this week I'm branching more into the law and how the place was governed and the basis for religious thought. The community, the cult I was a part of, had 4 founding principles on which it was built. And those were repentance, righteousness, common consent, and the storehouse. This week I'm going to focus on 1 and or maybe 2, depending on how much time we burn through discussing them. I'm going to start with repentance and we're going to work through it. I'm sorry, I've been pretty under the weather the past couple of weeks. Honestly, sleep is becoming an issue, but it's just insomnia. Anyway, repentance is what we're starting with. And repentance is, or was, for me anyway, I'm sure it's still like this, it was a process by which you atone for something you had done wrong to whoever, whether it was God or another person or even something in the environment. There were 5 basic steps to the process, and I think I remember these. It's really, really weird that so many years of drilling things into my head where I could have rehearsed it in my sleep and now I can't even remember it. That's really weird to me. But anyway, it was owning the sin, expanding on the effects of the sin to the person to whom you were confessing, apologizing and making amends, implementing a change, finding and implementing a change, and the process of forgiveness. Now, on the surface, this isn't necessarily a bad process. It might even be something that's very healthy. I don't know. But it didn't necessarily play out like that in real time. So the point of repentance was to mend things that you had done wrong to someone else, or to God, or to creation, or whatever. It was considered to be, or it was stated to be, the greatest act of love that a person could show another person was to call them to repentance or to inform them that they had sinned in some way against someone. So there was a lot of pressure in community that if someone came to you and said, hey, you kicked my dog and that wasn't cool, that you accept that and go through the steps of that, those 5 steps that I just listed. In something like kicking a dog, that's kind of an obvious case. That would be a good process to mend a broken relationship and find some resolve between 2 people. But the issue becomes much subtler as you move into things that maybe don't seem like a sin to most people. One of the real challenges of doing this podcast is knowing how to get the information out in a cohesive way, because everything ties into everything else so closely that it's almost impossible to find a starting place. So if it seems like we're just jumping into stuff, we are. That is literally what's happening. We're jumping right into the middle of it. So, sins that you might not think are necessarily sins, such as cursing. If you're by yourself and you say a potty word, no one is affected, unless you're in community, and then because it had a I don't think that polytheistic is the word that I'm looking for, but it kind of is. But a belief system that all of the earth is alive and has a spirit, you're offending the creation around you, you're offending God, and so then if you say a curse word, then you have to also fix that. So that seems like a good idea, and I think in many cases it was a good idea. The problem came for most people when the person calling another person to repentance had an idea that that person had sinned. They maybe hadn't necessarily sinned, but there was so much pressure to take that repentance that became the focus, and then it became a fight. And the other part of that was public reprimand. The language used in community was reproving somebody. That often happened in church or in a public setting. And not only is it embarrassing to get called out on something you did wrong in front of a whole bunch of people, it's not always necessarily appropriate. And oftentimes, a person's ability to overcome their emotions and deal with the problem was diminished because they were embarrassed and they were in the public eye. Now, being embarrassed and being ashamed of yourself was considered integral to the process of repentance. So that was considered to be a good thing, but it was also a barrier. And then that became a fight, and oftentimes in the public arena. So there were many church services, most if not all, I would venture to say, that there was some of that contention that you could be called out, sometimes very harshly, on something you had done wrong. Now, it wasn't just as simple as, most of the time, as just dealing with it. There was also the consequence of it. I mentioned in earlier episodes that the community was heavily inspired by the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically the Scroll of Community Rule or something like that. And then there's another one, I believe the Temple Scroll. I don't remember much of that. I mean, obviously I don't remember 5 simple steps that were drilled into me as rote for 20 years. I'm not sure I'm going to remember the names of obscure findings in the Judean wilderness. Anyways, from that, the community rule was taken, and that was the concept of days in which a person confessed their sin at every meal for a set amount of days, and then on some of them replaced a quarter portion of their food back into the pot. Originally, it was you get one plate, you put back a quarter of the food, and you're done. That later evolved into you can take as many plates as you want, but you're also putting a quarter back and confessing your sin every time. So you kind of had to weigh how much confession you wanted to do, and it couldn't just be a repeat of what you said. You had to add something new every time. So a simple problem could prevent multiple plates just based on that. So the community rule also had the feature of separating a person from some activities, and religious activities were held in the highest esteem pretty much of any activity outside of work. Working and laboring was very, very heavily focused on. And it had a kind of a place in community, a standing in the eyes of the members that was I don't know, it was weird. It was like that was the currency of being a real person, was your labor. It's very, very much a gung-ho blue collar attitude at times. Anyway, so religious activities such as holy days or certain meetings of certain members, a person on days could not attend those. And that was very difficult, because for everyone, whether they're willing to admit it or not, the attendance of those holy days and those meetings and so on was a sign of social status. It was a sign of acceptance in the eyes of people, and therefore God. So attending or not attending was a very big deal for everybody, and it was a very emotional deal. The other feature of days is that when you were on days, you would sit right by the door, and that was considered like the bench of holiness, because you were in the holy process of repentance. But it was, in effect, a way to single out people, and I'm not going to say pariah status, but I also wouldn't say that pariah status would be inaccurate. And in some cases, maybe even in many cases, pariah status absolutely what it was, even though that was pretty vehemently denied by the leadership. So when you were on days and you were sitting by the door, you had to confess your sin. Not surprisingly, that whole confession and discussion of sins and things that you were doing wrong was a very prominent feature of daily life and community. Sometimes it was a good thing. It could be very cathartic, and people who were not very pro-social were able to make strides in that area and become easier people to live around. It might be hard to imagine what it's like to be that close to people, but you're constantly in contact with the people that you live around, constantly. On your way to go get water from the well, when you're carrying it in buckets by hand, or on a yoke that's across your shoulders, you're going to meet probably several people on the way there. You might even meet somebody who's there was a little area for hand washing laundry that was fairly close to the well. You might see someone out there doing their laundry, or you might see somebody working in the garden, because the wells were right by gardens. So you were constantly interacting with the same people multiple times a day, outside of any jobs that you did with that person, or any religious events that you'd attended with that person. You're constantly around a person. It would be very rare unless that person was on a trip somewhere or was secluding themselves for a religious reason, it'd be pretty rare to go a week without seeing a person at least once. And if you lived in the same village as them, which was normally, I would say, 5 to 10 houses, you would see them. If you didn't see them every day, it started to feel a little weird. So being agreeable to the people around you and being willing to change to smooth the social scene is a pretty understandable motivation for change in behaviors that aren't pro-social. And I don't know that anyone would necessarily disagree with that. I don't think that the rub was there, to be honest. I think the rub was the amount of pushing that mistake in somebody's face for a certain amount of time, and how difficult it was to resolve, because once you had performed a behavior, of course people then have that perception of you, but it was very easy for that to become stigmatized. Let's see what I'm doing on time. Okay. Stop here. I'll be right back. So being stigmatized meant that people would view you in a certain way, and this is tricky to convey. It might take me actually several episodes of building this to actually be able to convey what things like stigma meant. Not only did you carry that shame with you, then people would begin to view you as someone who could not hear the Lord. And hearing the Lord, while it wasn't a foundation per se, it was very much foundational. Every person was supposed to be in communion with God continuously. And then when you received that inspiration, which was, internal, at least it was never any kind of auditory experience for me, despite the fact that I very much wanted that and tried for years to have that, just this internal feeling, then your expression to the person you're talking to is, the Lord is telling me whatever. So if you were on days or what have you considered the holiest process a person could be in, at least that was the semantics. The reality was you weren't, and then you were considered to be a person who either wasn't hearing the Lord or was having a hard time, and people shouldn't really trust your word. So you were seeing people every day. You were in there in that environment, and then there was that taint of distrust is how it played out in real time. I'm saying that a lot, and if it gets annoying, I'm sorry. It's just the way it is. While on days and while in that process, nope, I'm not going to go that direction. So a person in what was allegedly the most holy process that a person could undertake was also the person who in reality was in some of the lowest social standing. That was fought against a lot, not in actually making an effective change, but in denouncing it. Just like the repetition of "we're not a cult," "cults don't do this," "cults don't do that," was constantly repeated. So too was, "this is a holy process, you're being loved, you should you should accept what's going on and roll with it. But in reality, it was very different. Repentance and the nuance surrounding that merited from various ministers. I myself talked on it multiple times from the podium. Hundreds, if not thousands of hours of church time in sermons. Workshops were done on it. Retreats were done on it. All kinds of sermons and classes were done on it. In terms of conversation, I have no idea how I would even begin to calculate how many man years it was. We're spent talking about it. It was talked about literally every day, almost all the time. So it was a very, very big theme, very foundational, and it kind of set the tone for how people interacted with one another. It had and has, I think, the potential to be something that could very definitely improve relationships between people anywhere. But the whole outcome ended up being, for the most part, maybe not for the most part, but at least a reasonable percentage, that there was a factor of fear that motivated people rather than the pure intent that was preached. So people spent a lot of time changing because they didn't want to get caught up in the same behavior again, because the social stigma was harsh enough and uncomfortable enough that you didn't want to be around it. So I think that that's about going to do it for the first part of this, the initial of the four foundations of community, and it might not necessarily be 4 whole episodes. In fact, I would be surprised if it goes more than 2.5 or so. But anyway, that is repentance in a nutshell. If any of you who live there have any comments or anything you'd like to add, or anything you'd like to tell me or remind me of, examples would be fine. You know how to get at me if you don't have my phone number. Messenger on Facebook works fine. If you're a person who's unfamiliar with this and you feel like you'd like to know more details so you have a better understanding, ask me your questions. I'm always open. I rely on your feedback, as I've stated a lot. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to watch this. I hope it's interesting, and I hope you come back. If you see the potential in this to be something that you'd like to continue hearing and are interested in this story, like, subscribe, share, comment, question, all the obvious stuff. And until next week, I'm done.